I was sitting at my sister's engagement party when my father told his golf buddies how I work for some court system and make decent money for a clerk. But then Judge Patricia Morrison, my sister's future father-in-law, walked over and stopped dead when she saw me. Her face went white as she stammered, "Your Honor, Chief Justice Williams. I had no idea you were related to the Hendersons." The entire group fell silent as my family realized that the daughter they'd been mocking as a court clerk was actually the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Williams, and for the past 3 years, I've served as the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. But to my family, I'm just Elena, the daughter who works at the courthouse and makes what my father generously calls decent government money as a court clerk. I hadn't been home to Denver in 4 months, but my younger sister Jessica's engagement party was one of those family obligations that couldn't be avoided. The celebration was being held at the Cherry Creek Country Club, my father's pride and joy, where he'd been a member for 20 years and never missed an opportunity to show off his success in commercial real estate. The party was in full swing when I arrived, wearing a simple navy dress that I'd bought off the rack at Nordstrom. Everyone else looked polished and expensive, my father in his custom-tailored suit, my mother dripping in jewelry, Jessica radiant in her designer engagement dress. Her fiancé Marcus came from old Denver money, and his family's presence added an extra layer of social pressure to the evening. I found a quiet corner near the bar, hoping to avoid the inevitable conversations about my career. But family gatherings have a way of putting you exactly where you don't want to be. Elena works for the court system, my father was explaining to a group of his golf buddies, his voice carrying that tone of resigned disappointment I'd grown to recognize. It's steady work, good benefits. Not everyone can be an entrepreneur like Marcus here. The men nodded with that particular brand of sympathy reserved for parents whose children had failed to live up to expectations. Tom Bradley, my father's longtime friend and business partner, clapped him on the shoulder. "At least she's got job security, Bill. These government positions, they're recession-proof." "True," my father replied, glancing over at me with what he probably thought was an encouraging smile. "And the pay isn't terrible. She's got her own apartment, decent car, could be worse." The conversation stung more than it should have. The truth was infinitely more complex than their simple narrative of mediocrity and settling for less. I had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law, clerked for Justice Thompson, spent years as a federal appellate judge, and authored some of the most significant constitutional decisions of the past decade. But explaining that would require revealing an identity I'd worked hard to keep separate from my family life. To them, I was the daughter who'd started law school with such promise, then somehow ended up in what they assumed was a mid-level bureaucratic position. They didn't understand why I lived so modestly, why I never talked about my work, why I seemed to have no ambition for private practice or corporate law like my successful classmates. "She was always the smart one," my mother added, joining the conversation with her own brand of gentle condescension. "But sometimes being too smart can work against you. She overthinks everything, probably talked herself out of going for the big firms." Jessica approached our group, practically glowing with happiness. "Mom, have you met Marcus's father? He's a federal judge for the District of Colorado. Judge Morrison, this is my family." A distinguished man in his 60s approached with the bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in the room. Federal judges carry themselves with a particular kind of authority, measured, dignified, aware of their power but not ostentatious about it. "Judge Morrison," my father said, extending his hand with the enthusiasm of someone meeting legal royalty. "Bill Henderson. So honored to meet you. Your son is getting a wonderful girl." "The pleasure is mine," Judge Morrison replied warmly, "and please call me Pat. We're going to be family." The conversation continued, with the usual pleasantries about the engagement, the wedding plans, the joy of bringing two families together. I remained in the background, content to observe rather than participate. "Pat was just telling me about some of the interesting cases he's handled," Marcus said, clearly proud of his father's accomplishments. "Federal court must be fascinating work." "It has its moments," Judge Morrison replied with judicial understatement. Though I have to say, the most interesting constitutional questions usually end up at the Supreme Court level. My father seized the opening. Elena here works in the court system too. Not federal level, of course, but she's got a good position as a clerk. What my family didn't know was that 2 days earlier I had been presiding over oral arguments in one of the most significant constitutional cases of the century. While they assumed I was filing paperwork in some local courthouse, I was actually leading the Supreme Court's deliberation on questions that would shape American law for generations. The clerk position they pitied me for was actually the highest judicial office in the United States. My days began at 5:30 a.m. reviewing cert petitions that could fundamentally alter constitutional interpretation. I regularly made decisions that affected 330 million Americans, authored majority opinions that law schools would study for decades, and served as the final arbiter of constitutional disputes that lesser courts couldn't resolve. When they assumed I'd settled for a government job because private practice was too competitive, the truth was that I'd been nominated to the Supreme Court at age 45, the youngest Chief Justice in over a century. The President had personally called to offer me the position, and the Senate had confirmed me by a vote of 78 to 22, with even my political opponents acknowledging my exceptional qualifications. The modest apartment they worried about? It was actually a secure residence in Georgetown, chosen not for its size but for its proximity to the court and the extensive security modifications required for someone in my position. The simple clothing I wore wasn't from lack of means. It was from learned habit. When you spend your days in judicial robes, expensive fashion becomes irrelevant. While Jessica was still in law school studying landmark cases, I was writing them. The constitutional precedents her professors taught as historical milestones were decisions I'd authored in the past 3 years. The interesting Supreme Court cases that legal commentators analyzed on television were cases I'd personally guided through oral argument and conference deliberation. My family's assumption that I'd chosen the safer path was particularly ironic, given that my position required making decisions that would outlast any corporate partnership or real estate fortune. When I ruled on cases involving presidential power, voting rights, or constitutional interpretation, those decisions became permanent fixtures in American jurisprudence. The discretion they interpreted as lack of ambition was actually the highest level of judicial responsibility. I couldn't discuss my work at dinner parties because pending cases were confidential. I couldn't celebrate victories publicly because judicial neutrality required restraint. I couldn't explain my long hours because the court's internal deliberations were strictly protected. Even my apparent social isolation had a purpose. Chief Justices traditionally maintain distance from political and social circles to preserve the court's independence. My reluctance to attend family gatherings wasn't from shame about my career. It was from the constant pressure of representing the judicial branch's dignity and impartiality. The exhaustion they mistook for professional dissatisfaction came from the weight of constitutional responsibility. Every decision I made affected fundamental rights, federal-state relations, and the balance of governmental power. When I seemed distracted at family events, it was because I was mentally wrestling with questions that had no easy answers and enormous consequences. Tonight, watching my father apologetically explain my decent government job to Judge Morrison, I felt the familiar tension between my two lives. In one world, I was Chief Justice Williams, the constitutional scholar whose opinions were studied in law schools worldwide, whose decisions shaped the legal landscape for generations. In the other, I was just Elena, the daughter who'd somehow disappointed everyone by choosing stability over ambition, Tanda. The irony was suffocating. They measured success by visible wealth and social status, while I held the most prestigious position in American law. They worried about my lack of professional recognition, while legal scholars analyzed my every written word. They pitied my modest lifestyle, while I carried the responsibility of preserving constitutional democracy. But perhaps the most painful irony was that in trying to protect them from the pressure and scrutiny that came with my position, I had allowed them to believe I was everything. I wasn't. Ordinary, unremarkable, forgettable. The daughter who'd aimed too low, instead of the woman who'd reached the highest court in the land. As the conversation about my clerk position continued, my secure phone vibrated with the distinctive pattern that meant constitutional crisis. I discreetly checked the encrypted message under the table. Urgent. Executive Order 14,823 challenges separation of powers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Emergency conference call in 30 minutes. Court convening tomorrow morning. My stomach dropped. This was the scenario every Chief Justice dreaded, a direct constitutional confrontation between the branches of government that would require immediate judicial intervention. The President had just issued an executive order that directly challenged Congress's authority, and within hours, multiple parties would be filing for emergency injunctions. I excused myself to the restroom, my hands steady despite the gravity of the situation. In the privacy of the bathroom, I accessed the full briefing on my phone. The President's order essentially bypassed congressional budget authority, claiming emergency powers that hadn't been tested since the Civil War. Legal scholars would debate this for decades, but I had less than 12 hours to prepare for what could be the most significant constitutional crisis of my tenure. This was exactly the kind of case that defined Chief Justices. Moments when the balance of American democracy hung on judicial interpretation of constitutional principles. The executive order was already causing chaos in Congress, with leaders from both parties demanding immediate judicial review. Financial markets were reacting to the uncertainty, and international allies were questioning the stability of American constitutional governance. I called my chief clerk, who was already coordinating with the other justices' chambers. "Justice Williams," she said, her voice tense with the controlled urgency that marked constitutional emergencies. "We're looking at the fastest emergency petition processing in court history. The Attorney General's office is filing within the hour, and we have 17 amicus briefs already drafted. The timing was catastrophic." While my family celebrated Jessica's engagement, I was about to make decisions that would affect the fundamental structure of American government. The irony was crushing. They pitied my small career while I prepared to referee a constitutional crisis that would be studied in civics classes for generations. "Timeline for oral arguments?" I asked quietly. "Justice Thomas is requesting expedited review. We could have arguments scheduled within 48 hours if you approve emergency procedures." This wasn't just about legal precedent anymore. The President's order had created a constitutional showdown that threatened the separation of powers doctrine itself. If the court upheld the order, it would fundamentally alter the balance between executive and legislative authority. If we struck it down, we'd be making a definitive statement about the limits of presidential power during national emergencies. I returned to the party, where my father was still explaining to Judge Morrison how I'd found my niche in the court system. The conversation felt surreal. They were discussing my supposed career limitations while I was mentally preparing for oral arguments that would determine whether the President had overstepped constitutional bounds. "Elena's always been content with steady work," my mother was saying to Mrs. Morrison. "Not everyone needs to be at the top of their field." Judge Morrison nodded politely, though I caught him glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. As a federal judge, he would certainly be aware of the constitutional crisis developing, but he had no idea that the woman standing next to him would be leading the Supreme Court's response. My phone buzzed again with updates from the other justices. Justice Kennedy was requesting preliminary briefs, Justice Ginsburg wanted clarification on procedural timelines, and Justice Scalia was already drafting questions for oral argument. The court was mobilizing for what could be the most important case of the decade. "Sarah, you look distracted," Jessica observed, approaching with Marcus and his father. "Everything okay?" "Just tired," I replied, calculating how quickly I could leave without causing suspicion. In less than 6 hours, I would need to be in Washington for an emergency conference call that would determine the court's approach to this constitutional crisis. The celebration that was supposed to honor Jessica's engagement was about to become the night my family discovered that their underachieving daughter was actually about to referee the most significant constitutional showdown in recent American history. I was trying to calculate how to gracefully exit the party when Judge Morrison approached me directly, extending his hand with the courtesy that federal judges show to everyone. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced," he said warmly. "I'm Judge Patricia Morrison, District of Colorado." My heart stopped. I had been careful to avoid direct conversation with him all evening, knowing that any federal judge would immediately recognize me. But now, with my father beaming proudly at what he saw as his daughter finally getting attention from someone important, there was no escape. "Elena Henderson," I replied, hoping against hope that he might not make the connection in a social setting. Judge Morrison's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. His eyes narrowed slightly, studying my face with the careful attention that judges bring to identifying crucial details. I watched as recognition dawned, his professional composure barely containing his shock. "I'm sorry," he said slowly, his voice carrying a note of confusion. "You look remarkably familiar. Have we met in a professional capacity?" My father jumped in eagerly. "Oh, Elena works in the court system too. Maybe you've crossed paths. She's got a good position as a clerk." Judge Morrison's face went completely white. He stared at me, then at my father, then back at me. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, filled with the kind of reverence that federal judges reserve for only the highest judicial authority. "Your Honor," he began, then stopped, clearly struggling with the impossibility of the situation. "Chief Justice Williams, I had no idea you were related to the Hendersons." The words hung in the air like a physical force. Every conversation within 20 feet stopped instantly. My father's champagne glass froze halfway to his lips. My mother's hand went to her throat. Jessica's mouth fell open in complete bewilderment. "What did you just say?" my father asked, his voice cracking slightly. Judge Morrison seemed to realize the magnitude of what he'd just revealed. He looked at me with an expression that was part apology, part awe. I'm sorry, Your Honor. I didn't realize your family wasn't aware of your position." "Your Honor?" my mother repeated, her voice barely audible. "Elena, what is he talking about?" The moment I'd been dreading for 3 years was happening in the worst possible circumstances. Not only was my cover blown, but it was happening while I was trying to manage a constitutional crisis that required my immediate attention. "Yes," I said simply, my voice steady despite the chaos erupting around me. "I'm the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court." The silence that followed was deafening. Tom Bradley's face went slack. My father looked like he was solving a complex mathematical equation in his head. Jessica grabbed Marcus's arm as if she needed physical support. Judge Morrison, professional to his core, tried to salvage the situation. "Your Honor, I apologize for the breach of protocol. I should have recognized that you were maintaining privacy with your family." "Chief Justice?" my father whispered, as if saying it louder would make it less true. "Elena, you're telling me you're the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court? The actual Supreme Court?" "For the past 3 years," I confirmed, watching as the reality began to sink in around the table. Marcus found his voice first. "Dad, are you saying Elena is your boss? Like, your actual boss?" Judge Morrison nodded slowly. "The Chief Justice is the head of the federal judiciary. She's the highest-ranking judicial officer in the United States." The group of golf buddies who had been listening to my father's explanation of my decent clerk job now stared at me with expressions ranging from awe to complete bewilderment. The woman they'd been pitying for her lack of ambition was actually the most powerful judicial figure in the country. "Elena," my mother said faintly, "why didn't you tell us?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with another urgent message about the constitutional crisis. The irony was overwhelming. Here I was, finally revealed as the Chief Justice, while simultaneously managing what could become the most significant constitutional case of my tenure. 30 minutes later, I found myself in an unprecedented situation, conducting an emergency Supreme Court conference call from a private dining room at the Cherry Creek Country Club while my family watched in stunned silence. Judge Morrison had offered his secure phone for the connection, and Jessica had cleared the room of other guests to give us privacy. "Chief Justice Williams," came the voice of Justice Kennedy through the encrypted line. "We now have formal petitions from both the House and Senate leadership requesting emergency injunction on Executive Order 14,823. This is moving faster than Bush versus Gore." My family sat around the table like observers at a constitutional law seminar, watching me transform from their disappointing daughter into the person who would decide the fate of American democracy. Jessica's mouth was still slightly open, processing that her sister was receiving real-time briefings on what the news was already calling, quote, the constitutional crisis of the century. What's the procedural timeline? I asked, pulling up legal documents on my phone while simultaneously coordinating with the court's administrative staff. We can expedite oral arguments for tomorrow afternoon if you approve emergency procedures. Justice Thomas's voice came through the speaker. But Elena, the implications here are staggering. If we rule against the president, we're essentially saying executive emergency powers have constitutional limits, even during national crises. Judge Morrison leaned forward, his judicial experience overriding his shock. Your Honor, may I ask about the constitutional grounds for the challenge? This sounds like a separation of powers issue that could fundamentally alter the balance between branches. I glanced at him, then at my family, making a split-second decision about how much I could reveal. The president's order bypasses congressional appropriations authority during what he's calling a, quote, national security emergency. It's essentially claiming that executive power can override legislative control of federal spending. My father's face had gone completely pale. Elena, you're telling me you're about to decide whether the President of the United States overstepped his authority? Not just me, I replied, authorizing procedural motions on my phone. The full court will hear arguments, but as Chief Justice, I'll be presiding over what could be the most significant constitutional case since Marbury v. Madison. Justice Ginsburg's voice came through the speaker again. Elena, we need your decision on media access. Every major network is requesting live coverage, and C-SPAN is pushing for gavel-to-gavel broadcast. The weight of the decision hit me as I looked around the table at my family. This wasn't just about constitutional law. It was about the fundamental structure of American government, being decided in real time while the world watched. Approved, I said without hesitation. The American people deserve to see how constitutional crises are resolved. Full media access, with standard court protocols. Marcus finally found his voice. Elena, you're saying that tomorrow the entire country will be watching you decide whether the president broke the Constitution? That's exactly what I'm saying, I replied, coordinating with the court's security detail about tomorrow's enhanced protection protocols. Judge Morrison was staring at me with something approaching reverence. Your Honor, I've been a federal judge for 15 years, and I've never seen anything move this fast through the system. The constitutional implications of this case will be studied for generations. My mother was gripping her napkin so tightly her knuckles were white. Elena, when you say constitutional crisis, do you mean the kind that could change how our government works? I mean the kind that tests whether our constitutional system can handle conflicts between branches of government, I replied. The president claims emergency powers that Congress says violate the Constitution. Tomorrow, 9 justices will decide who's right. The irony wasn't lost on anyone at the table. They'd spent years pitying my lack of visible success, while I'd been quietly preparing for exactly this kind of moment, the nightmare scenario that every Chief Justice hopes never happens, but trains for constantly. As I coordinated the most expedited Supreme Court case in modern history, my family finally understood that their underachieving daughter had actually been carrying the weight of constitutional democracy on her shoulders, invisible and unrecognized for years. 4 hours later, as I prepared for the most important case of my career from my hotel room, the call I'd been dreading came through. Justice David Blackwood, my former colleague from the appellate court and current associate justice, appeared on my secure video link with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, calculating, and utterly without the collegial respect that had defined our relationship for over a decade. Elena, he said, his voice measured and formal. We need to discuss your handling of this constitutional crisis. Something in his tone immediately put me on alert. Blackwood had been my closest ally on the court, the justice who'd supported my nomination as Chief Justice, who'd helped me navigate the complex dynamics of leading 8 other strong-willed jurists. He was supposed to be calling to coordinate our approach to tomorrow's arguments, not to question my leadership. David, what's wrong? I asked, studying his face through the screen. The emergency procedures are working perfectly. We've expedited this case faster than any in court history. That's exactly the problem, he replied, and I felt the temperature in the room drop. You've rushed into this constitutional showdown without proper consultation with the full court. You've authorized live television coverage without a formal vote. You've made decisions that put the court's reputation at risk. I stared at him in disbelief. David, we had a constitutional crisis requiring immediate judicial intervention. The president issued an order that directly challenges the separation of powers. Emergency procedures exist for exactly these situations. Do they? He leaned forward, his expression hardening. Or did you see an opportunity to cement your legacy as Chief Justice by inserting the court into a political battle that we could have avoided? The words hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a colleague expressing procedural concerns. This was a calculated attack on my judgment and my motivations for taking this case. What are you really saying, David? Blackwood pulled out a tablet and began reading from what appeared to be an official document. I'm saying that several justices have expressed concerns about your decision-making since you became Chief Justice. The rushed timeline, the media circus, the appearance of judicial activism. This case might be the culmination of a pattern of concerning leadership choices. My blood went cold. I recognized the language. It was the same terminology used when justices were being prepared for censure or removal. Someone had been building a case against my leadership, documenting every decision, every moment of assertive judicial authority. David, you know that's not true. You know me better than anyone on this court. Do I? He asked, and his voice carried a tone I'd never heard before. When was the last time you consulted with the full court before making a major decision? When was the last time you seemed concerned about the political implications of our rulings instead of just the legal ones? The betrayal cut deeper than any professional criticism could have. This man had been like a mentor to me, had celebrated my nomination as Chief Justice, had understood the delicate balance required to lead the highest court in the land. Now he was weaponizing my decisive leadership against me. I've been doing my job, I said firmly. And my job requires making difficult decisions about constitutional interpretation under tremendous pressure. Your job also requires building consensus and maintaining the court's institutional integrity. This constitutional crisis demonstrates a concerning pattern of unilateral decision-making that puts you at odds with judicial restraint. I realized with growing horror that this wasn't a conversation about tomorrow's case. This was a carefully orchestrated intervention designed to question my fitness for the Chief Justice position. Someone had been preparing for this moment, documenting my leadership style, building a case that my assertive approach to constitutional law was actually judicial overreach. David, who initiated this evaluation? He hesitated for just a moment, and in that pause, I saw the truth. This wasn't his idea. Someone had convinced him to have this conversation, to plant seeds of doubt about my leadership, at the moment when I most needed institutional support. The other justices are concerned, he said finally. There's been discussion about whether the pressure of leading the court during constitutional crises has become too much for you. The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. Tomorrow's case hadn't just exposed my secret identity to my family, it had also provided the perfect opportunity for someone who wanted me removed to question every aspect of my judicial philosophy. The next morning, I woke up to find my judicial career under systematic assault. The Washington Post headline read, Chief Justice's Leadership Questioned During Constitutional Crisis. The article, clearly sourced from inside the Supreme Court, painted a picture of an authoritarian leader who had rushed into a constitutional showdown without proper deliberation and consensus building. The story detailed my pattern of unilateral decision-making since becoming Chief Justice, citing anonymous sources who described me as increasingly isolated from my colleagues and dismissive of institutional norms. It mentioned my failure to build consensus and my tendency toward judicial activism that bordered on political interference. Every aspect of my decisive leadership was being reframed as evidence of overreach. My quick responses to constitutional crises became hasty judgments without proper reflection. My streamlined emergency procedures became, quote, bypassing established protocols. My willingness to allow media coverage became grandstanding that compromised judicial dignity. Justice Thomas called within minutes of the story breaking. Elena, this is a coordinated leak campaign. Someone's been feeding information to the press for weeks, building a narrative that you're unfit to lead the court. Who? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. It has to be coming from inside the court. The details about our conference discussions, your administrative decisions, your approach to case management. This is information that only the other justices would have access to. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Just as I was presiding over the most significant constitutional case in years, someone was systematically undermining my credibility and judicial reputation. The constitutional crisis hadn't just exposed my identity to my family, it had provided the perfect cover for a judicial coup. By noon, 3 more articles had appeared in major publications, all carrying the same theme. Chief Justice Elena Williams was a brilliant legal mind who had overstepped her authority as court leader. The stories painted me as a tragic figure who had sacrificed collegiality for efficiency and lost perspective on the court's proper role. Senator Margaret Hayes, chairwoman of the Judiciary Committee, issued a statement calling for examination of my leadership during the constitutional crisis. The American people deserve Supreme Court leadership that's both decisive and collaborative, she told reporters. Chief Justice Williams's approach to this case raises questions about her understanding of judicial restraint. The most devastating blow came when Justice Blackwood held an impromptu press conference. Standing on the court's steps, he expressed, concerns about the decision-making process during the constitutional crisis. While I have great respect for Chief Justice Williams's legal acumen, he said, I believe the court would benefit from a more deliberative approach to constitutional interpretation. His carefully worded statement was presented as evidence that even my closest allies had lost confidence in my leadership. The narrative was becoming self-fulfilling. As more justices distanced themselves from my approach, others felt safer joining the chorus of criticism. Jessica called me that afternoon, her voice shaking with anger. Elena, I'm watching the news and I can't believe what they're saying about you. Judge Morrison told Marcus that your handling of this case is exactly what constitutional scholars dream of, decisive leadership during a genuine crisis. The truth doesn't matter right now, I told her. Someone wants me removed as Chief Justice, and they're using every tool at their disposal to make it happen. But why? You're the most qualified person for this job. Your constitutional scholarship speaks for itself. I thought about that question as I watched my reputation being dismantled in real time. Why, indeed? The constitutional crisis case was proceeding exactly as it should, expedited but thorough, with full due process and appropriate media transparency. My leadership had been textbook crisis management. The answer was becoming clear. Someone didn't want a Chief Justice who was willing to take on constitutional challenges without political calculation. They wanted someone more deferential, more willing to consider institutional reputation over constitutional principle. My independence, the very quality that made me effective during constitutional crises, had also made me a target. In a court increasingly concerned with public perception and political ramifications, a Chief Justice who prioritized constitutional interpretation above all else was seen as a liability. As I prepared for oral arguments that would determine the future of executive power, I realized that the real battle wasn't about presidential authority or separation of powers. It was about whether constitutional leadership could survive in an increasingly politicized judiciary. The Supreme Court chamber was packed to capacity, with every seat filled and cameras positioned to capture what legal historians were already calling the constitutional showdown of the century. I sat at the center of the bench, flanked by 8 associate justices, facing a courtroom that held the future of American democracy in its hands. Behind the bar, in the public gallery, I could see my family, Jessica, my parents, even Judge Morrison, sitting in the front row with expressions of fierce determination. The case was United States versus Executive Order 14823, and it would determine whether the president had overstepped constitutional bounds by bypassing congressional authority during a declared national emergency. As Chief Justice, I would not only preside over the arguments but also guide the court's final decision. The Honorable, the Chief Justice, and the Associate Justices of the Supreme Court of the United States, announced the court crier as we took our seats. Oyez! 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 All persons having business before the Honorable, the Supreme Court of the United States, are admonished to draw near and give their attention, for the court is now sitting. The weight of the moment settled over the chamber like a heavy blanket. Every word spoken here would be analyzed by constitutional scholars for generations. Every question I asked would be scrutinized for judicial philosophy and constitutional interpretation. "Mr. Chief Justice," began the Solicitor General, representing the President's position, "this case presents a fundamental question about executive power during national emergencies. The President's order was issued under clear statutory authority granted by Congress in the National Emergencies Act." I leaned forward, my voice carrying the authority of the nation's highest court. "Counselor, the National Emergencies Act grants the President broad powers, but does it grant unlimited power to circumvent the Constitution's separation of powers doctrine?" The Solicitor General paused, clearly recognizing the trap in my question. "Your Honor, the President's powers during emergencies have always been expansive. From Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus to Roosevelt's wartime authorities, executive power expands during national crises." "But, Counselor," I continued, "each of those examples you cite was later reviewed and constrained by either Congress or this court. Are you arguing that executive emergency powers are completely unreviewable?" The question hung in the air like a constitutional challenge. I could see Justice Blackwood shifting uncomfortably, but I pressed forward. This wasn't about my leadership style or judicial philosophy. It was about the fundamental principle that no branch of government, not even the executive during emergencies, operates above constitutional constraints. "Your Honor," the Solicitor General replied, "we're arguing that the President's emergency powers must be given deference during active national crises." "Deference, yes," I said, "but not abdication of judicial responsibility. The Constitution doesn't include an emergency exception clause." Justice Thomas leaned into his microphone. "Chief Justice Williams, are you suggesting that the court should second-guess every presidential decision during national emergencies?" I turned to face him directly. "I'm suggesting, Justice Thomas, that the Constitution means what it says even during emergencies. Perhaps especially during emergencies." The chamber was completely silent now, every person present understanding that they were witnessing constitutional history being made. This wasn't just about one executive order, it was about the fundamental balance of power in American democracy. "The Constitution," I continued, my voice carrying to every corner of the chamber, "was written by people who understood that emergency powers are precisely when constitutional constraints matter most. The founders didn't fight a revolution against executive overreach, only to create a system where the President could claim unlimited authority during crises." I could see my family in the gallery finally understanding the full weight of what their daughter had been carrying. Jessica was crying, not from sadness but from pride, finally comprehending that her sister wasn't just a judge, she was the guardian of constitutional democracy. "This court," I concluded, "will not abdicate its responsibility to interpret the Constitution simply because the executive branch finds that interpretation inconvenient during a crisis." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the scratching of pens, as reporters captured what would become one of the most quoted moments in Supreme Court history. The court deliberated for 3 days. When we reconvened to announce our decision, the chamber was even more packed than before, with constitutional scholars, government officials, and media representatives filling every available seat. The decision in United States versus Executive Order 14,823 would reshape the balance of power in American government for generations. I read the majority opinion aloud, my voice carrying the weight of constitutional history. The court finds, by a vote of 7-2, that Executive Order 14,823 exceeds the constitutional authority granted to the President, even during declared national emergencies. The separation of powers doctrine does not include an exception for crises. The reaction was immediate and thunderous. Applause erupted from the gallery despite the court's strict protocols, and I could see my family in the front row, tears streaming down their faces as they finally understood the full magnitude of what their daughter had accomplished. But the real vindication came in the hours that followed. Within minutes of the decision's announcement, legal scholars across the country began praising not just the ruling but my leadership during the constitutional crisis. Professor Alan Dershowitz appeared on CNN calling it the most decisive and principled leadership we've seen from a Chief Justice in decades. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who had joined the majority, released a statement that evening. Chief Justice Williams demonstrated exactly the kind of constitutional courage our founders envisioned. She prioritized constitutional principle over political convenience, and American democracy is stronger for it. The truth about the internal campaign against me began to emerge within hours. An investigation by the Washington Post revealed that Justice Blackwood had been coordinating with outside political groups who wanted a more politically compliant Chief Justice. The same organizations that had opposed my nomination 3 years earlier had been funding a sophisticated campaign to undermine my leadership. Justice Thomas called with the news I'd been waiting for. "Elena, Blackwood just submitted his resignation. And the 3 justices who questioned your leadership? They've all issued public statements acknowledging that your handling of this crisis was constitutionally sound and procedurally correct." The vindication was swift and complete. Editorial boards across the political spectrum condemned the attempt to politicize the Supreme Court's internal deliberations. The president, despite losing the case, issued a statement praising my, quote, "unwavering commitment to constitutional principles even under intense pressure." My family gathered that evening at Judge Morrison's home in Denver for what Jessica called a proper celebration of constitutional democracy. This time, there were no awkward silences or disappointed looks about my career choices. Judge Morrison, humbled and apologetic, raised his glass first. "To Chief Justice Williams," he said, his voice thick with emotion and professional respect. "I spent my entire career thinking I understood constitutional law when you were actually writing it. I'm sorry it took a Supreme Court decision for me to see what was right in front of me." My father stood next, tears in his eyes. "Elena, I measured success by all the wrong standards. I thought achievement meant making money and getting recognition. I never understood that the most important work protects the very foundations of our democracy." Jessica was the last to speak, her voice breaking with pride. "Elena, you've been my hero this whole time, even when I was too blind to see it. Thank you for showing me what real leadership looks like." But perhaps the most meaningful vindication came from an unexpected source. The next morning, I received a handwritten letter from a young law student at Harvard who had watched the entire proceedings on C-SPAN. "Chief Justice Williams," she wrote, "watching you defend the Constitution against political pressure inspired me to pursue constitutional law. Thank you for showing that principle matters more than politics." For the first time in 3 years, I didn't have to hide who I was or apologize for the constitutional stands I'd taken. My family finally understood that their disappointing daughter had actually been serving as the guardian of American democracy, carrying the weight of constitutional interpretation on her shoulders, while they worried about her lack of visible success. 6 months later, I stood at the podium in the Supreme Court's East Conference Room, addressing a packed audience of constitutional scholars, federal judges, and law students from across the country. The occasion was the launch of the new Constitutional Leadership Institute, designed to train the next generation of federal judges in principled decision-making during national crises. In the front row sat Jessica, now in her final year of law school and planning to clerk for a federal appellate judge after graduation. Beside her, Marcus beamed with pride as his father, Judge Morrison, prepared to introduce me. Behind them, my parents sat with expressions of wonder and admiration, finally understanding the scope of the work their daughter had been doing in silence for years. The constitutional crisis of Executive Order 14,823 taught us that judicial leadership requires more than legal expertise. I began, my voice carrying easily through the packed room. It requires the courage to defend constitutional principles, even when that defense is unpopular, the wisdom to distinguish between legal precedent and political pressure, and the resilience to continue serving even when that service is misunderstood. The audience included several faces I recognized from my darkest days, former critics who had publicly apologized once the truth about the campaign against me became clear. The political organization's involvement had been exposed in a series of investigative reports that led to Senate hearings and new ethics rules for judicial conduct. Judge Morrison took the podium next, his voice carrying the respect of someone who had witnessed constitutional history firsthand. Chief Justice Williams didn't just preside over a landmark case, he said. She demonstrated that the Supreme Court can still serve as the guardian of constitutional democracy when political pressures threaten to overwhelm legal principles. After the ceremony, my family joined me for dinner at a small restaurant near the Capitol. The conversation was relaxed, natural, no more awkward silences or disappointed glances about my career choices. They asked detailed questions about constitutional law, genuinely interested in understanding the complexities of Supreme Court decision-making and judicial philosophy. "Elena," my father said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand, "I need to say something. For years, I measured success by the wrong standards. I thought achievement meant being visible, making money, getting social recognition. I never understood that the most important work often happens where no one can see it, protecting principles that most people take for granted." Jessica nodded emphatically. "Working with constitutional law professors now, I see your influence everywhere. The separation of powers doctrine, the limits on executive authority, the protection of judicial independence. Your decisions are shaping how we understand American democracy." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry it took so long to see you, really see you. You were protecting the Constitution while we were worried about country club conversations and dinner party small talk." As we walked back to our cars, Jessica linked her arm through mine. "You know what's funny? Judge Morrison still talks about that engagement party sometimes. He says it was the moment he realized that constitutional law wasn't just an academic subject, that real people make real decisions that affect everyone's lives." The work continues, as it always will. There are new constitutional challenges emerging, new crises requiring swift judicial intervention, new cases that will test the boundaries of governmental power. But now I face these challenges with something I hadn't had for years: the unqualified support of a family who finally understands that being powerful doesn't always mean being visible. Sometimes the greatest strength comes from standing guard over principles that others take for granted, protecting constitutional democracy from those who would compromise it for temporary advantage. Sometimes being misunderstood is the price of doing what's right. And sometimes, when the truth finally emerges, it illuminates not just your own worth, but the value of every person who chooses duty over recognition, principle over popularity, and constitutional fidelity over political convenience. The Constitution endures because people are willing to defend it, even when no one is watching, even when no one understands, even when the cost is being called a failure by those who matter most. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.